There is something in the water ahead, a shape that shouldn't exist this far from shore. Too wide, too tall, too dark. A wall of timber rising out of the black ocean like a cliff that learned to float. A forest of masts reaching into the storm sky. And then the thunder comes, not from the clouds, from the cannons. Every pirate alive that night feels the same thought hit them at the same moment. That ship is worth dying for. This was the Galleon, the floating fortress that carried the wealth of entire empires, silver, spices, silk, the written promises of kings. It was not built to be beautiful, it was built to endure, to survive oceans that swallowed other ships whole, to cross distances that broke lesser vessels, to tempt every monster on the sea with a hold full of treasure and come out the other side. When pirates spotted one on the horizon, they didn't see a ship, they saw years of plunder riding the current toward them. But the Galleon kept a secret, because the richest target in the world was also the most dangerous one. And that is exactly where the nightmare begins. The Galleon was not born from greed, it was born from fear. Fear of storms, fear of distance, fear of watching an empire dissolve into the sea because the ships carrying its wealth were not strong enough to survive the crossing. In the 1500s and 1600s, the ocean was not a highway, it was an execution ground. If a kingdom wanted silver from the Americas or silk from the far coasts of Asia, it needed something that could endure cannon fire, 6-month voyages, and waves that had never heard of mercy. So the shipbuilders responded. They made the hulls deeper, the sides higher, the timber frames denser. They took merchant vessels and slowly turned them into armored giants. But every solution created a new problem. The Galleon became heavier, slower, more visible. It was a fortress, yes, but a fortress flying a flag, announcing to every set of eyes on the water exactly where the wealth was hiding. And the moment that happened, something shifted. Pirates stopped looking at ships, they started looking at targets. What made a galleon terrifying wasn't just its size, it was what it could do when it decided to fight back. Cannon ports lined both sides, each one capable of unleashing a broadside that could shred a smaller vessel in seconds. Tall, stern castles gave gunners a commanding angle over anyone foolish enough to approach. Walls of thick timber could absorb punishment that would reduce a lighter ship to drifting splinters. On paper, the galleon was a trade vessel. In reality, it was a war machine that happened to carry cargo. Some were armed enough to give pirates pause before they even fired the first shot. But the sea is merciless to arrogance. A galleon could become dangerously unstable if overloaded. Too much treasure, too many supplies, too many human lives packed into a wooden box in the middle of the Atlantic, and the fortress would quietly turn fragile. That contradiction was what made them so fascinating and so deadly. Designed to dominate the ocean, yet one mistake in loading, one hidden leak, one well-placed cannonball could send a kingdom's pride to the bottom. They were built to be invincible. They died like everything else. We like to imagine gold spilling out of every galleon. The truth is more dangerous and far more interesting. Yes, some carried silver bars, stamped coins, pearls, and rare goods, but they also carried something harder to see and far more valuable: the machinery of empire. Contracts, debts, legal documents, weapons, officials, prisoners, human lives locked into a system that stretched across entire oceans, all of it riding inside a single wooden hull. That is what pirates were really hunting. Not just treasure, leverage. A captured galleon didn't just mean riches, it meant ransom, political shock, chaos rippling through ports thousands of miles away. Sometimes the most devastating prize wasn't the cargo at all, it was the panic its disappearance created. The ship was a moving nerve center. Strike it, and the entire colonial network would feel the wound. And that made every voyage feel like a secret,
one that could be discovered at any moment by entirely the wrong people.
For pirates, the galleon was the impossible dream. Not because it was easy, because it was nearly impossible. A successful capture could change a crew's life overnight. It could buy ships, weapons, safe harbor, and loyalty. It could transform one desperate raid into living legend. That possibility, that single night of perfect violence paying off everything, is what turned the galleon into an obsession. Pirates studied schedules, weather patterns, trade routes, harbor reports. They waited in choke points where the heavy ships would have to slow down, where geography forced them close to shallow water, where a bad wind could steal their options. But they were always gambling against a fortress that could shoot back. The galleon couldn't outrun them, but it could destroy them if they hesitated too long or came in wrong. This was never a fair fight. It was a hunt between desperation and discipline. And the pirates chasing galleons knew something no one wanted to say out loud. The easiest ship to dream about was often the hardest ship to survive.
The sea was both the galleon's armor and its prison. In open water, a pirate crew might circle for hours, waiting for wind, angle, and courage to align before making their move. But near reefs, sandbars, and narrow channels, the massive ship could become trapped by its own weight. A vessel built to dominate the open ocean, suddenly helpless in shallow water. That was the real horror of the chase. The same route that kept trade alive could become a death corridor overnight. Galleons were forced to sail predictable paths. Geography controlled them. Pirates learnt this. They didn't need to outgun empires. They needed patience and the willingness to let the ocean do the work. A storm could pin a galleon in place. A hidden shoal could slow it. One bad turn could expose the weak side to a perfectly timed broadside. One fire ship sent drifting into the hull. One boarding party cresting the rail at the worst possible moment. The fortress didn't need to be sunk. It only needed to be made impossible to escape. And the sea, given enough time, had a talent for exactly that.
A galleon could survive an enemy. The weather was harder. Storms tore at sails and snapped masts and turned disciplined decks into violent chaos in minutes. Water poured through the cannon ports. Men were thrown against railings or over them entirely. Powder stores could be ruined by a single wave breaking where it shouldn't. And below deck, the cargo became a nightmare of its own. Silver shifting against the hull, barrels breaking loose and crashing in the dark. The ship listing just enough to push everyone's fear past the point of reason. The historical record is unambiguous. More galleons were lost to weather and navigation than any pirate in history. And that makes the legend darker, because the sea didn't always defeat them dramatically. Sometimes it simply erased them. No cannon smoke, no last stand, no enemy to blame. Just a break in the storm, an empty horizon, and an ocean that had quietly swallowed a fortune without leaving any trace. Sometimes no one ever saw the wreck again. Sometimes nobody even knew where to look.
Beneath the legend, there were people, trapped inside the wood. Sailors who slept in conditions that were damp and foul-smelling, who lived with hunger, sickness, and a fear that never fully left. Officers who watched the cargo with more attention than they gave the men. Gunners who waited, prisoners who had no choice at all. Crew and labourers' families, all sharing the same floating world, but not the same fate. The galleon was a fortress for the empire. It was never meant to be comfortable for the people inside it. Historians know that voyages became tests of endurance long before any pirate ship ever appeared. Scorched tongues from thirst, fever spreading through the lower decks, salt sores, rats in the holds working through the cargo, the psychological weight of knowing they were carrying something that could make them rich or get killed defending someone else's wealth. And when the first unfamiliar sail appeared on the horizon,
panic didn't spread through the crew like a warning, it spread like fire, faster than any cannonball had ever moved.
Galleons did not drift through history at random. They were part of systems so vast, so deliberate, that they connected entire continents to each other like stitching in a wound. The Manila galleons linked Asia and the Americas in a loop that had never existed before. Silver moving one way, luxury goods moving the other, empires growing fat on the exchange. Spanish treasure fleets followed routes that pirates memorized the way priests memorized scripture, because these routes were predictable. Empires depend on predictability, and that predictability was the crack in the wall. Pirates, privateers, and enemy navies all watched those same lanes because they understood something important. Whoever could interrupt the ocean's money supply could shake governments from thousands of miles away. That is why capturing a single galleon could cause panic in a capital city the captor had never visited. It was not just a ship, it was a moving piece of a global machine. And once that was understood, hunting galleons became something larger than theft. It became war, just conducted at sea, with no flags, no treaties, and no rules.
Some encounters ended before anyone ever tried the board. A pirate ship would fire first, targeting masts, rigging, anything that could slow the galleon enough to close the gap. The galleon answered, and when a galleon answered, it answered with everything. Cannon smoke swallowed the deck's hull, wood exploded, men disappeared into spray and splinters and the ringing silence that follows destruction. That was the moment the dream turned to blood. Because if the galleon had enough guns, enough trained men, and enough distance to operate, the attack could collapse in seconds. Pirates who came in too confident, too slow, or at the wrong angle learned this immediately and did not always survive the lesson. But if panic touched the galleon's deck first, one wounded officer, one broken wheel, one fire starting below, everything changed without warning. Victory could flip in a heartbeat. That unpredictability is what made these battles so brutal in the historical memory. There was no elegance in it. It was a mathematics problem written in cannon smoke and screaming, solved in real time, with the ocean keeping score. And the ocean never showed mercy to whoever got the equation wrong.
Some galleons survived the battles. They just didn't survive the centuries. Wrecks buried under sand and coral have surfaced again, hundreds of years after they went down, still holding coins, ceramics, weapons, and the small, intimate objects of daily life. Below the water, treasure doesn't look like fantasy. It looks like evidence. A broken plate, a rusted buckle, a cannon resting half swallowed by the seabed, growing coral the way old trees grow bark. Each object says the same quiet thing. People were here, and then they were gone. Archaeologists can reconstruct the trade route, the cargo manifest, the moment of disaster. They can piece together what happened in the final hours, sometimes even in the final minutes. What they cannot restore is the fear on the deck that last night, the orders being shouted into a wind that wasn't listening, the sound the ship made before it stopped making sounds at all. That is what makes wrecks so haunting. They are not ruins, they are frozen endings. And when the sea gives one back, it rarely returns the whole story. Just enough to make you ask what else is still down there. Just enough to make sure you never stop wondering.
Here is the part that surprises people. Galleons were not easy prizes. They were enormous, hard to board, often sailing with escort ships and built to sustain damage. They were too slow to chase a fleeing enemy and still too dangerous to attack without precision. Pirates needed timing, intelligence, and luck, all working in the same direction at the same moment. Miss any one of them and the galleons sailed away, fortune intact, crew unharmed, the empire's trade uninterrupted. The pirate myth loves the image of effortless victory. Real history tells a harsher story. Most attacks failed. Many crews starved, waiting for the right moment that never came. Captains who grew reputations for hunting galleons also became targets themselves, hunted by the same navies that protected the ships they chased. The sea rewarded patience and intelligence. It punished bravado with silence and a slow, anonymous death. That is precisely why a successful galleon capture became legend. It wasn't just wealth, it was proof that someone had beaten a system specifically designed to be unbeatable. And that is exactly why the idea of taking one never stopped seducing men who knew, deep down, that it probably wasn't possible.
No fortress lasts forever. That is the one thing history never forgets to prove. Naval design improved. Ships became faster, more agile, more specialized. Cannons evolved. Tactics shifted. The empires that had built galleons began building something different, and the galleon, which had once been the perfect answer to the fear of the open ocean, started to look like what it was becoming, a relic of a world that was quietly ending. History is cruel that way. The moment a design becomes legendary is often the moment it starts to die. But the image survived everything else. The towering stern, the heavy sails catching stormlight, the cannon-lined sides glowing with the orange flash of a broadside. It lived in paintings, in stories, in the maritime memory of cultures that grew up hearing about what those ships once meant. Long after the last great galleon was broken down for timber, the shape of it still haunted the imagination. That is the strange, persistent power of a ship like this. It does not need to remain dominant to remain terrifying. The old monster keeps haunting us because we know what it once was, and because some small part of us believes that in the right storm, it might still be.
The most dangerous thing about a galleon was never the gold. It was the idea of gold. The idea that a single ship could change a life, a port, a kingdom, the outcome of a war. That idea was more powerful than any cannon ever cast because it travelled farther and hit harder and could not be sunk. It drove pirates to the very edge of death and over it. It drove empires to station warships on every major trade lane in the world. It drove generations of people to stare at old maps and wonder what might still be resting, undiscovered, on the ocean floor. That is why galleons still haunt us. Not because they were the prettiest ships, not because they were the fastest, but because they turned the ocean into a vault and then dared the entire world to crack it open. Every wreck discovered, every archive unsealed, every chart restudied only deepens what we don't know. The treasure is never just the treasure. The real prize is what the ship reveals about the human things that never change: greed and ambition, and the terrible price that empires make other people pay.
So when you picture the galleon, do not picture an old ship. Picture a moving kingdom, a locked vault drifting across the world's most dangerous roads, a battlefield that could appear without warning in waters that were supposed to be safe, a grave for the men who sailed it and the men who hunted it, a promise made by empires to themselves that the ocean could be controlled, that the wealth would arrive, that the system would hold. It never held forever. Nothing does. Pirates dreamed of capturing the galleon because it represented what the sea almost never gave to anyone: control, the ability to reach out and take the thing that empires spent entire fortunes protecting. And yet, the galleon was never just a target, it was a mirror, a reminder that power at sea always casts a shadow, that the higher the cargo, the darker the water around it, the heavier the treasure, the closer the people who would die to take it. Maybe that is why it still feels alive to us, not because it survived every storm, it didn't, not because it won every battle, it didn't, but because for a brief and terrifying moment in history, one wooden ship could carry the fate of the world in its hold, and the ocean, cold and indifferent as it has always been, would sometimes let it through, and sometimes, without a word,
it wouldn't.